The sky was a dull crimson, streaked with the fading embers of a dying star. The world below lay in silence, its once thriving cities now nothing more than crumbling monuments to a forgotten past. What remained of humanity clung to scattered colonies, orbiting distant planets, and for most the old Earth was but a myth, an ancient memory swallowed by the void. The mountain range in the east, towering and unyielding, had become the last sanctuary of a dying craft. The forge nestled within its heart hummed with a faint glow, its fires burning not just to melt metal but to keep alive an art that had long since faded from the universe's collective memory. Eryx, the last of the great blacksmiths, stood alone in that forge, his hands steady despite the weight of time. He had lived longer than most of the ancient technology he surrounded himself with, more than the embers of the old world that flickered within his hearth. His workbench, cluttered with half-forged swords, axes and other relics, was illuminated only by the pale light of his anvil. The hammer he held in his hand felt heavy, not because of its size, but because of its significance. In the old days this hammer had shaped the future of civilizations. It had been wielded by emperors, generals and kings, each strike a promise of protection, each piece of metal a legacy. Now however it felt like a tool of decay. What once gave birth to power was now a mere echo. For Eryx, the forge had become both a prison and a sanctuary. He had forged shields so legendary that entire wars were won with just one. He had crafted armor that turned the tide of conflicts that spanned star systems. Yet, with every shield he made, with every piece of armor, his heart grew heavier. The power he bestowed upon others, the ability to protect, had always been misused. The very thing that made him famous had contributed to the downfall of the worlds he had sworn to protect. But now the world outside the forge was gone, and so too were the kingdoms. Empires had crumbled, and the once great civilizations were little more than dust in the wind. The only thing left were stories, whispered among the scattered survivors who had long since forgotten what true strength looked like. There were no more kings, no more generals. There were no armies to defend, no nations to protect. Just Eryx and his forge. The old man let out a long sigh and dropped the hammer onto his anvil with a dull clang. He wiped his brow with a cloth, his movements slow, deliberate, and heavy with years of fatigue. The silence of the mountains was a comfort, but it was also suffocating. It had been years since he had forged a shield, years since anyone had come to request one of his legendary creations. And yet, in the deepest recesses of his mind, he knew it wouldn't last. The world had a way of calling him back, pulling him into its chaos, and when it did, he would be forced to face his past once again. It was then that he heard the first sound in days, a distant thrum growing louder with every passing second. The forge trembled beneath his feet as a ship descended from the sky, its engines roaring as it sliced through the still air. Eryx stepped to the edge of the mountain's cliffside and squinted against the bright lights of the descending ship. His fingers brushed against the ancient runes etched into the stone, a reminder of the old magic that once empowered his craft. For a moment, his mind wandered back to the days when these symbols were used to imbue shields with powers beyond comprehension, when his work wasn't just about metal and fire, but about preserving entire civilizations. The ship landed with a thud, sending dust scattering across the mountainside. Eryx did not move. He stood there watching, waiting as the figure stepped out from the shadows of the ship. She was a woman, tall and regal, her dark armor glistening in the fading light. Her eyes, hidden beneath a visor, were the only part of her face visible, and they burned with a fierce determination that mirrored the fire he had seen in the eyes of kings long ago. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the rocky ground as she approached the forge. Eryx could feel it in his bones. She had come for something. He had no doubt that she knew exactly who he was and what he could do. She had come for the one thing that had been left untouched in all these years, the very shield that had once been the symbol of power and protection across the galaxies. He had sworn never to forge another. Eryx's mind raced, recalling the last time he had crafted such a shield. It was the shield that had ended the Great War, the one that had turned the tides in favor of a dying kingdom. The shield that, after its use, had caused the collapse of entire star systems, leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. He had sworn to never again create such a powerful weapon, for fear that it would be misused, just as the others had been. But the woman who stood before him was different. She carried the weight of a universe on her shoulders, and in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years: hope. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gravelly and worn. The woman's visor clicked open, revealing a face marked by battle and time. She met his gaze with unwavering certainty. "I need one of your shields," she said, her voice steady. "My people are dying. And I believe you are the only one who can save them." For a moment, Eric said nothing. The weight of her words settled around him, and he knew that his peace would be shattered once again. He had heard these words before from kings and generals. He had forged shields for them all, and each time, it had led to devastation. "Why should I?" he asked, his voice thick with the burden of the past. "Because I'm not asking for power," she replied, her gaze fierce. "I'm asking for protection. For them. For my people. And for the future." Eric stood still for a long time, the hammer resting at his side. The forge glowed with an ancient fire, waiting for his decision. The choice was simple yet profound. In that moment, Eric knew that his past, his legacy, was not just a chain. It was also a lifeline. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment where his work could once again do something meaningful. Not for empires, not for kings, but for the very people who still believed in the power of a shield to protect, rather than to conquer. With a deep breath he finally spoke. "You'll get your shield," he said, his voice soft but resolute. "But know this, it's not just a piece of metal. It's the last of its kind. And with it comes a responsibility greater than you can imagine." Alara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. And so, the last blacksmith and the last hope of a dying people began their work, together. The sky, once a pristine blue, now burned with a sickly orange hue, as though the very heavens themselves were coughing up the last vestiges of a dying world. Below, the last remnants of humanity huddled in the shadows of forgotten cities and abandoned spaceships, their hearts heavy with the weight of their survival. The air smelled of dust, metal, and something else. Something ancient, as if the planet itself had been forced to remember a time it wished to forget. And in the midst of this desolation, there was only silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a shroud, a silence so deep that it begins to gnaw at the edges of your sanity. It was the silence of a dying world, one that had witnessed the fall of empires, the collapse of civilizations, and the end of an age. But on this day the silence was broken. A shadow stretched across the broken earth, not the kind that belongs to any natural being, but something far larger, something that seemed to promise both destruction and salvation in the same breath. The sound of engines rumbled through the valley, distant at first but growing louder by the second. A ship, sleek, dark, and intimidating, pierced the sky, its metallic surface reflecting the dying light of the sun. It was a ship like no other, built for war, built for survival. Built to find what it sought and leave nothing behind. Eric's, the last of the great blacksmiths, stood at the edge of his forge, his weathered hands gripping the stone railing as he watched the descending ship. The low hum of its engine sent a shiver down his spine. He had spent years in this remote forge, far away from the world, hoping to leave behind the chaos that once defined his craft. Yet, it seemed the world had a way of calling him back, pulling him into its madness when least expected. With a sigh, he turned away from the ship, his eyes briefly resting on the shadows of his past that hung heavy in the corners of his forge. The fire crackled in the hearth, its glow flickering like a heartbeat, and yet even the flames could not keep the cold at bay. The woman who emerged from the ship was unlike any he had seen before. She moved with an eerie grace, her black armor gleaming in the twilight. It was a contrast to the world around her, this wasteland of dust and decay. Her silhouette was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the valley as though she belonged to a different time, a time when the world still had purpose. Her face was hidden beneath a visor, but even from a distance, Eric could sense the intensity in her presence. There was power in the way she walked, a kind of power that made the air itself hold its breath. As she approached the forge, her boots barely made a sound against the rocky ground, each step calculated, deliberate, and heavy with intent. Eric could feel her eyes, even though they were shielded by her visor, locking onto him. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He had lived too long in solitude to be easily startled. The woman stopped a few paces from the entrance of the forge. The faintest hint of wind stirred the air between them, but it was more of a whisper than a breeze. She stood still for a long moment as if sizing up the old blacksmith, assessing him, and the air between them thickened with an unspoken understanding. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "You're Eric's," she said, her voice low and commanding, yet somehow carrying a softness that belied the weight of her words. "The last of the great blacksmiths?" Eric's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He had heard the title before. In fact, he had grown weary of hearing it. It meant nothing now, not when there was nothing left to forge, nothing left to protect. "I've heard of your work," she continued, her gaze never leaving him. "I've heard that you've crafted shields so powerful they've saved entire worlds." "Saved?" Eric's muttered, the words slipping from his lips like a curse. He turned his back on her, the familiar weight of the hammer still in his hand. "I've also heard that those same shields have caused more destruction than I could ever imagine. What use is saving a world if it means losing everything else?" The woman stepped forward, her movements slow but purposeful. She didn't flinch at his words, didn't back down. Instead, she reached up and removed her visor, revealing her face for the first time. Her features were sharp, etched with the strain of countless battles, and yet there was a fire in her eyes, an intensity that neither age nor time could diminish. "My name is Alara," she said. "And I'm here because I need one of those shields." Eric's could feel his heart tighten at the mention of the shields. The shields he had sworn never to create again. The shields that had brought him more pain than he could bear. He gripped his hammer tighter, feeling the familiar weight of it, the tool that had shaped the fate of so many. He looked down at the anvil before him, the place where his greatest creations had come to life, and for a moment he considered ignoring her, turning his back once again on the world that had so often disappointed him. But something in Alara's gaze made him pause. There was no arrogance in her eyes, no thirst for power. There was only desperation and something deeper, something that spoke to the very core of his own long-buried humanity. "What makes you think I'll help you?" Eric's asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Alara's expression softened, and for the first time she dropped her guard. "Because," she said quietly, "my people are dying. The last of us. We've been fighting for so long, and I don't know how much longer we can hold out. But I've heard of your shields, the ones that can withstand the greatest of forces. If you can make just one, then maybe we can survive. Maybe we can keep fighting." Eric's eyes flickered toward the mountains beyond the forge, toward the distant stars where other civilizations once thrived, only to fall to the darkness of time and war. He had seen it all before, he had been the one to craft the weapons that had torn worlds apart. But in Alara's voice there was something different. A quiet, unyielding resolve. She wasn't asking for conquest. She was asking for survival. And in that moment something in Eric stirred. A memory, perhaps, of a time when he had believed in something greater than himself. The old blacksmith set down his hammer with a heavy thud. "I'll make you your shield," he said, his voice thick with the weight of past decisions. "But know this, a shield is only as good as the hands that wield it. And a shield, no matter how strong, cannot protect you from the consequences of your own actions." Alara nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She had come for a weapon, but what she was about to face was far beyond the scope of any shield. The forge came alive once more, the flames rising in response to the call of destiny. Eric's began his work. And Alara, the last hope of her people, waited. The hammer fell again and again. The rhythmic clang of metal striking metal echoed through the forge, a sound that had once been a source of pride for Eric's. Now it was a sound that cut through the air like a whisper from the past, the heavy weight of each blow reminding him of the price he had paid for his craft. The forge was alive with the heat of creation, but it felt different now, darker, more solemn. As if the flames themselves carried the burden of what was to come. Eric's wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands calloused and worn from years of labor. His fingers trembled slightly as he took the next piece of molten metal from the furnace. He could feel it in his bones, the tension that had settled into the air between him and Alara. She stood in the corner of the forge, silent and watchful, her eyes never straying from him for too long. There was an intensity in her gaze that made the room feel smaller, as if she were searching for something more than just a weapon. The moment they had shared outside the forge, when she had asked for his help, had been heavy with unspoken words. Eric's knew she wasn't just seeking a shield, she was seeking hope. And hope was a fragile thing. He had seen it broken too many times to believe in it anymore. But Alara's resolve was something different. It wasn't the blind hope of the naive, but the kind of hope that was born from desperation, the kind that had been tempered in the fires of war. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way her armor gleamed even in the dying light of the forge. She was a soldier, yes, but she was more than that. She was the last remnant of something greater. A testament to survival. And maybe, just maybe, she believed in the power of a shield. Eric's placed the glowing metal onto the anvil, the heat radiating off it like the very essence of the sun itself. He paused for a moment, watching the way the flames danced in the hearth. "You know," he said softly, breaking the silence, "I've forged shields for kings, generals, and entire armies. But I've never made one for someone like you." Alara's gaze didn't waver. "Someone like me?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Eric's didn't look at her immediately. Instead, he picked up his hammer once more, the weight of it a familiar presence in his hand. "Someone who's lost everything and still keeps fighting?" There was a long silence before Alara spoke again. "I haven't lost everything," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not yet." Eric's finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her face. There was something in her expression, a depth of emotion that she hadn't shown before. For the first time, Eric saw the cracks in her armor, not the physical one but the emotional one. She had her walls, just like everyone else who had survived this long. But they were starting to show signs of wear. The sound of the hammer ringing out once more filled the space between them, as if to fill the emptiness that had suddenly grown. Eric struck the metal again, shaping it, bending it to his will. But there was a part of him that wasn't focused on the shield. A part of him was focused on Alara, on the story she carried in her eyes, in the lines of tension in her posture, and in the weight of her mission. "You don't have to do this," he said finally, his voice gruff. "You don't have to keep fighting." "I don't have a choice," Alara replied, her voice firm again. "If I stop fighting, we all die. My people die. I can't let that happen." "You'll die too," Eric said bluntly, his voice edged with the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Everyone who fights eventually dies. The question is whether the fight is worth it." For a moment, Alara didn't respond. She took a step forward, her eyes not leaving the blacksmith as she closed the distance between them. "What's your fight, Eric's?" she asked, her voice now softer, quieter. "What do you fight for? What's worth it for you?" The question hung in the air like a rope, pulling at the edges of his soul. Eric's paused, the hammer still in his hand. His eyes flickered to the shield he was crafting, a thing of beauty and danger. A thing that could protect but could also destroy. And suddenly, for the first time in years, the question she asked didn't seem so simple. What was he fighting for? The question lingered in his mind, and for a moment he didn't know how to answer. The forge had been his life for as long as he could remember. But in the years of solitude he had forged more than just weapons and shields. He had forged a cage for himself, a prison of his own making, built from the ashes of the battles he had fought, the lives he had shaped, and the worlds he had watched burn. "I don't fight for anything anymore," he said quietly, setting the hammer down. His words were heavy, full of resignation. "I used to believe in things. I used to think that what I made would make a difference. But nothing ever lasts. Nothing ever changes." "You're wrong," Alara replied, her voice low but fierce. "Everything you've made has made a difference. Everything you've built is still here. It's still real." Eric's looked at her then, his gaze searching, uncertain. "And what about you? What happens when you've fought enough? What happens when you've given everything and there's nothing left?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'll keep fighting anyway." Her words, simple and honest, struck something deep within him. For a moment, Eric saw the weight of her burden, the quiet strength that had carried her through the hardest of times. And in that moment, something in him stirred, something long dormant, something he had buried beneath layers of time and regret. He looked down at the shield once more, the edges beginning to take shape, the curves forming with the precision of a master's hand. This wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a promise. A symbol of everything Elara stood for, everything she was willing to fight for. With a slow, deliberate motion, Erix reached for the hammer once more. "I'll finish it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll finish it and I'll make it worth the fight." And as the hammer rang out again, louder this time, Elara stood in the silence that followed. The weight of their conversation hung between them, but now there was something different in the air. A shared understanding, a bond forged in the fire of their words and their actions. The shield would be ready. And with it, perhaps, so would they both be.